When's the next vote?
We got 2 minutes.
I don't
I
care.
think it's number 4.
It's good, we got plenty of time.
Yeah, we got time. So, you have your story?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's down. He's down there in case
That was
the
nice.
craze.
Last night, Rodney? That was nice what he said, too. That was really nice. No, it's how we all feel. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador, Catherine. The hearing will come to order, and I want to thank you for being here for this important hearing. My co-chair and I are extremely grateful for the work you're doing. I'd like to just give a brief opening remarks and then go to Jim, and then we'll go to our two first witnesses. This year, as you know, marks the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and the occasion provides an opportunity for reflection and assessment of the TVPA's efficacy, accomplishments, and limitations. It also provides us with an opportunity to think about future challenges, many of which could not have been anticipated 20 years ago, such as how ever-evolving technology is being utilized by both traffickers for their nefarious purposes and also law enforcement as it seeks to protect the vulnerable and the exploited. But first, to look back, though it's hard to believe it now, when I first introduced the TVPA, the legislation was met with a wall of skepticism and opposition, dismissed by many as a solution in search of a problem. Several members of Congress actually turned me down when I asked them to co-sponsor the bill. For most people at the time, including lawmakers, the term trafficking applied almost exclusively to drugs and weapons, not human beings. And that goes for attorneys general as well as U.S. attorneys with whom I met with many. And all they wanted to talk about was drugs and weapons. Reports of vulnerable persons, especially women, being reduced to commodities for sale were often met with surprise, incredulity, and indifference. My legislation, which was bipartisan, bicameral, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, signed into law in the year 2000, created a new whole-of-government domestic and international strategy and established numerous new programs to, first, protect victims, prosecute traffickers, and to the extent possible, prevent it in the first place, the 3 Ps. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act included a number of sea change criminal code reforms, including treating as a victim and not a perpetrator of a crime anyone exploited by commercial sex and who had not attained the age of 18, and anyone older where there was an element of force, fraud, or coercion. The TVPA radically reformed the U.S. Criminal Code to authorize asset confiscation and jail sentences of up to life imprisonment. Section 1590 of the Act, for example, said whoever knowingly recruits, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains by any means for labor or services shall be fined or imprisoned not more than 20 years. The next section, Section 1591, said on sex trafficking for children by force, fraud, or coercion, stipulates whoever knowingly or in affecting interstate commerce recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains by any means a person or benefits financially or by receiving anything of value shall be liable up to 20 years imprisonment and a fine. And then if they have not attained the age of 18, or if 18 older, force, fraud, or coercion would have to be involved. And a violation against a child who has not attained the age of 14 carries up to life imprisonment. Thousands of human traffickers have been prosecuted and jailed pursuing to the TVPA, including all charges brought against Jeffrey Epstein and the infamous convictions involving Smallville actress Allison Mack. That said, in believing that the federal law needed parallel state and local statutes to effectuate and effective prosecution, the law included new DOJ programs to assist states in crafting laws and authorized the creation of a new anti-human trafficking task forces, and today there are some 57 throughout the country. In like manner, the TVPA provides law reform and best practices and technical assistance to other countries. We want the whole world on the same page with laws, policies, and priorities that aggressively attack this insidious evil. The Act also includes sheltering and a national hotline, and on the refugee side, created a new asylum category known as the T-Visa to protect victims and their families. Among its other provisions, the TVPA created the Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, the U.S. Department of State's Trafficking in Persons Office, the annual TIP report, and its tier grading of every nation's record in making serious and sustained efforts to eliminate human trafficking. As we all know, those relegated to what we call Tier 3, egregious violators, are subject to sanctions. I would just note, in 2008, I introduced a bill known as International Megan's Law. It passed the House in 2010, 14, and 16, and finally cleared the U.S. Senate 8 years later in 2016. As you all recall, or some of you recall who know me, Megan Kanka was from my hometown of Hamilton, was just 7 years old when she was kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered in 1994. Her assailant lived across the street. Unbeknownst to her family and other residents in the neighborhood, he was a convicted repeat child sex offender. Megan's heartbroken to this day parents, and I know them very well, Richard Kanka and Maureen. Richard's actually on the school board in Hamilton, have been amazingly effective, courageous, and heroic in successfully pushing every state in the Union, including New Jersey, to enact Megan's Law. Why International Megan's Law? We know from law enforcement, academia, and media documentation that Americans on the U.S. sex offender registries are frequently caught sexually abusing children in Asia, Central and South America, Europe, and frankly everywhere. Indeed, this was the point made just a couple of days ago on the Conference on Human Trafficking. And again, one of our witnesses, Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, was on the panel, and it was yesterday, frankly, that discussed the international and transnational aspects of human trafficking. The inherent secrecy of international travel enables child exploitation. So many of these people do it in secret. A deeply disturbing report by the GAO had found in just 1 year, 2008, 4,500 U.S. passports were issued to registered sex offenders. Typically, as we all know, a passport is valid for 10 years, meaning that some or many of the tens of thousands of registered sex offenders possessing passports may be on the prowl internationally, looking to exploit and to abuse. Now under IML, I should say, International Megan's Law, convicted child sex offenders who travel abroad must provide notice to the U.S. government via the Angel Watch Center prior to departure of all planned destinations. Failure to do so carries a significant jail term commensurate with the convicted child sex abusers not reporting to local law enforcement. Under receipt of the travel itinerary, the U.S. government informs the destination country or countries of those plans. The destination country or countries are then empowered with actionable information to render the traveler inadmissible. The law is working as intended. In just over 2 years, the U.S. government has notified foreign governments of the planned travel of 10,541 covered sex offenders to their countries. As of July, 3,681 individuals who were convicted of sex crimes against kids were denied entry by those nations. Concerned that some may fail to include their true destinations when filing, and out of an abundance of caution and concern for children, their passports contain the following message that will not likely go unnoticed by border agents, and that is, the bearer was convicted of a sex crime against a minor and is a covered sex offender pursuant to 22 U.S. Code 212B. The act also created a new policy of reciprocity, an attempt to get other countries to warn us when a convicted pedophile plans to travel to the United States, empowering us to deny entry. Just some of you may know this, I've served as the special rep for combating human trafficking in the Parliamentary Assembly for the OSCE, and we work very closely with many of our friends and colleagues in other countries. Again, trying to get everybody on that same page, share best practices, and then implement and implement and implement. Finally, last January, President Trump signed the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. It provides about $430 million for programs and initiatives, shelter, interventions, reintegration, and a whole lot of other things. But one of the aspects of it that is so important, and I know Ms. Chan will speak to this, is that it also, in consultation with the Education and Secretary of Labor, authorizes the Secretary of Health and Human Services to establish programs in partnership with nonprofit NGOs to establish, expand, and support programs to educate school staff to recognize and respond to signs of sex and labor trafficking, and to provide age-appropriate information to students on how to avoid becoming victims of sex and labor trafficking. A number of NGOs have certainly stepped up to the plate on this issue. Family Initiatives Project of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, Just Ask, A21, the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children, and others But we need everyone covered, every child, private parochial schools, wherever they're attending school, to know about what they need to be aware of in terms of the grave threat that they may face. I would remind my colleagues that the ILO suggests that 1 in 4 trafficking victims are children. And I would also point out that women and girls are disproportionately affected by both forced labor and account for the majority of victims in the commercial sex industry. However, there was a 2013 report from ECPAT USA entitled "And Boys Too," and concluded that the scope of commercial exploitation of boys is vastly underreported. Laurie Cohen, ECPAT's executive director, will be among our witnesses today and will, I'm sure, speak to that. A 2016 study by the Department of Justice found that 36% of children forced into U.S. sex industry in the United States were male. And the Polaris Project has, in like manner, said that sex trafficking within residences informally used as brothels typically involve child victims, with boys making up a growing percentage. So again, I want to thank all of our colleagues for being here. We will be focusing on some other areas too, including the whole issue of cryptocurrencies, which is, I know, very much in the crosshairs of our government leaders, and I hope to hear more about what they're doing on this important issue. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Co-Chair Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to join with Co-Chair Smith in welcoming all the witnesses here today on this important hearing on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the Tvpa. And I also want to thank him for his incredible work on this issue over many, many years. I think he has been responsible for literally saving countless lives, and we're grateful for his leadership on that. And I want to extend a special welcome to our witnesses. I'm glad that both the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services are joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time, and we also appreciate your work. Human trafficking is the process by which individuals are placed or maintained in an exploitive situation through force, fraud, or coercion for purposes of economic gain. It affects men, women, and children, and it involves a wide range of practices, including commercial sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced marriage, involuntary domestic servitude, and the use of child soldiers. Human trafficking concerns this Commission because it involves the violation of so many human rights, from the discrimination that makes some populations vulnerable in the first place, to the violation of the rights to liberty and security, freedom of association, movement, and just conditions of work. These rights and many more are abused for victims of human trafficking. For the last 2 decades, the U.S. response to the scourge of human trafficking has been guided by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as amended and reauthorized. And we are here today to take stock of the contributions of the Tvpa to the global fight to eliminate human trafficking and to identify challenges going forward. I think it's important to start off by recognizing the good news. Since 2000, attention to human trafficking has grown both internationally and within the United States. Around the world, the number of countries that have criminalized human trafficking has increased significantly. Human trafficking is an area where U.S. and international law are pretty well aligned, and in which the U.S. has played an important leadership role. But when I look at the map of country rankings in the 2019 Trafficking in Persons Report, only 33 of the 184 countries are fully compliant with minimum standards to combat severe forms of human trafficking. That's 18%. Tier 2 watch plus Tier 3 countries count for nearly twice that share, 32%. By the way, being a Tier 1 country doesn't mean a country is out of the woods. The United States has strong laws on the books and good strategies to combat human trafficking within our borders. But we still have a real problem with illegal sexual and labor exploitation. So there's plenty of work that still needs to be done. So one of our objectives today is to identify recommendations for action by Congress. And when it comes to human trafficking, Congress has been deeply engaged on a bipartisan basis. Tvpa reauthorizations have provided a regular opportunity to revisit and improve the law, and I will be interested to hear what additional improvements our witnesses will recommend. For example, should the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking be more specific with regard to the knowing commission of acts of labor trafficking? I also hope that we will ask how anti-trafficking efforts interact with the larger human rights picture within countries, and with overall U.S. human rights policy, both in terms of law and practice? Can we be successful in reducing human trafficking in countries that are riven by corruption or do not have effective justice systems, especially if the problem of trafficking is as much domestic as international? How successful can we be in combating labor trafficking in countries that thoroughly disrespect labor rights? At a minimum, I have to think that the underlying human rights situation in a country, including its respect for economic and social rights, shapes success when it comes to prevention and prosecution. I also wonder whether we hold our allies to the same standards as our adversaries in evaluating their progress in fighting trafficking and holding them accountable. In 2019, for example, Colombia was ranked as Tier 1 in spite of persistent and long-standing reports of recruitment of child soldiers. In the Western Hemisphere, the Tier 2 watch and Tier 3 countries are those with which we have the most difficult relationships, including Cuba and Venezuela. Yet India, which many experts believe has the largest number of victims of trafficking, and Qatar, which has a well-known problem of passport retention, are both Tier 2 countries. So there are a lot of factors involved here, and weighing all of them is difficult, I know. That said, is there more we can do to insulate the TIP report, a very valuable tool, from the risk or even the perception of politicization of the rankings? So going forward, are there challenges we face best addressed by continuing to update the TVPA, or do we need to focus instead on implementing the laws we have, or on improving legislation that specifically addresses issues like the use of forced labor and supply chains? These are some of the questions on my mind on this important anniversary, and I look forward to hearing the views of all the witnesses. Again, I thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Hank Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank both of you all for hosting this very important issue. Trafficking in people is something that's been with us since humanity began, and we've made some progress, but it's a never-ending fight. I appreciate the panelists for being here today to elucidate us on today's issues concerning sex trafficking and other trafficking, other human trafficking. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now introduce our first panel, beginning with Ambassador John Cotton, who serves as the U.S. Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons and leads the department's office. Ambassador Richmond comes to the highest position in the federal government on this issue, dedicated to combating trafficking after a distinguished career in the global battle for freedom. He co-founded the Human Trafficking Institute that exists to decimate modern slavery at its source by empowering police and prosecutors to use victim-centered and trauma-informed methods to hold traffickers accountable and ensure survivors are treated with utmost respect and care. Ambassador Richmond earned his bachelor's from the University of Mary Washington and his JD from Wake Forest University School of Law. We'll then hear from Catherine Chun, who is the founding director of the Office on Trafficking in Persons and senior advisor on human trafficking at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As director, Ms. Chun leads the office and determines certification and eligibility for survivors of human trafficking who may be eligible for refugee benefits and services. She is the federal executive officer of the National Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth in the U.S. Catherine received her Master of Public Administration from Harvard Kennedy School and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Brown University and a certificate in executive nonprofit leadership from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
It's my honor to represent the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. I'm grateful for this opportunity to reflect on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and discuss how we might continue this fight. Human trafficking, what some call modern slavery, should have no place in our world. As both a grave crime and a human rights violation, it compromises national security, undermines the rule of law, and harms the well-being of individuals and communities everywhere. This year is noteworthy as it marks the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And to mark this historic milestone, we're declaring the year of 2020 Freedom First, in recognition that human dignity and freedom are essential to the exercise of all of our other rights and liberties. Delivering on the promise of freedom for millions of people whom traffickers exploit must remain one of our top priorities. It's appropriate that I am before members of Congress today to remember the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This movement is indebted to members of Congress and their staff who worked with determination to enact the TVPA. In particular, I'd like to thank Congressman Chris Smith, my new colleague Ambassador Brownback, and late Senator Paul Wellstone for leading the efforts in Congress to enact this landmark law, which is based on the fundamental principle that trafficking in persons is an affront to human dignity and the worth of all people. The enactment of the TVPA in 2000 was a transformative event in the legal framework and our ability to combat all forms of human trafficking. At the same time, the passage of the TVPA ensured that this issue would be integrated into our foreign policy and our diplomatic engagement. Allow me to highlight 3 ways the TVPA dramatically shifted the movement in combating human trafficking. The first is the TVPA embedded a victim-centered approach throughout its provisions. A victim-centered approach requires that we keep victims informed and honor their participation and their opinions throughout the criminal justice and recovery process. A victim-centered approach impacts everything from how law enforcement conducts their investigations to how judges must order traffickers to pay restitution to their victims. One particularly helpful victim-centered innovation in the TVPA was the T-Visa, which provides temporary protection for victims to remain in the United States, to receive services, and to help the government hold their traffickers accountable. The T-Visa is a best practice, and I can tell you that as I engage with countries around the world, we hold it up as a practice to be replicated in their anti-trafficking efforts. Secondly, the TVPA introduced the idea of nonviolent coercion, and that was later reinforced by the United Nations in the Palermo Protocol. Although Palermo uses slightly different language to address this, it's very similar and gets to the heart of the basic idea. The TVPA's remarkably broad definition of coercion includes threats of serious harm, explicitly physical violence, but also psychological harm and reputational harm. The expanded definition of coercion was a game-changing advancement in the legal framework. Prior to Palermo and the TVPA, most governments outlawed human trafficking only when force or threats of force or physical restraint was used against a person to compel them to work or to engage in a commercial sex act. But as we know, this limited understanding of the means that traffickers employ, traffickers often use other means, including exploiting family history, educational backgrounds, language skills, immigration status, and other unique vulnerabilities to coerce their victims. However, the full implementation of criminalizing traffickers' use of nonviolent coercion remains a challenge. As I travel, I consistently hear reports of police and prosecutors, as well as judges and social workers and other government officials, refusing to hold traffickers accountable because their trafficker did not use physical force. What this retreat to a pre-TVPA and pre-Palermo view practically means is that we are failing to identify most of the world's trafficking victims. The best global estimate of human trafficking victims comes from the International Labor Organization, which estimates that there are 24.9 million victims in the world. According to the 2019 TIP report, governments and other sources reported identifying 85,613 victims of trafficking. Based on these global numbers, we are only identifying 0.3% of the global victims. And I believe this overly narrow view of what constitutes coercion is a contributing factor. This prevents governments from identifying victims, providing trauma-informed services, and criminally prosecuting their traffickers. and I welcome and value your insights and contributions on how we can address this issue so that we can better fulfill the promise of the TVPA. Finally, but significantly, the TVPA created the Trafficking in Persons Report, an annual effort by the State Department to assess countries' efforts to meet the minimum standards to combat trafficking in persons. And as my colleagues and I prepare the 20th TIP report, its impact over the past 20 years is undeniable. I can tell you from my extensive global travel and meetings with foreign governments, there is one concern they share in common. They care about their ranking in the TIP report. The report is an irreplaceable resource to foster dialogue with foreign governments and guide our strategy for foreign assistance and training and technical assistance to strengthen governments' efforts to stop traffickers and protect victims. While the TVPA was a monumental bipartisan legislative effort, our work is not yet finished. Although laws are foundationally important for the work, we must also ensure successful implementation of those laws. Governments must turn words into actions by investing in effective justice delivery systems and effective systems of protection. I'd like to highlight several areas within the 3P paradigm that is prosecution, protection, and prevention for all of us to focus our efforts on. I'm grateful in prevention that there's been an increased attention and interest around prevention efforts. It's an essential component to effectively address trafficking in persons. I'm worried, however, that prevention of trafficking is often conflated with first ending poverty or attempts to generally reduce all vulnerability. While governments and NGOs certainly should invest in global efforts to end poverty, we should dispel the notion within the anti-trafficking field that poverty causes trafficking. It does not. Poverty, droughts, conflict, lack of education, dysfunctional families, and other social ills increase individuals' vulnerabilities. But the critical distinction with human trafficking is that it is a crime driven by opportunistic criminals who prey on the vulnerable people because they are easier to exploit. Simply put, vulnerabilities are not the root cause of trafficking. Traffickers are the root cause. They are the ones who make the intentional decision to treat inherently valuable people as a disposable commodity. In a world of finite resources, we should prioritize programs that directly address holding traffickers accountable and meeting the needs of victims, rather than allowing these funds to drift into general poverty alleviation efforts, safe migration programs, or other laudable initiatives. We must work with precision in our prevention efforts to focus groups of people whom traffickers are actually targeting, such as children aging out of the foster care system in the United States, workers laboring under the kafala system in the Gulf, or people fleeced by unscrupulous recruiters worldwide. We must be as targeted and vigilant in our noble efforts as the traffickers are in their criminal efforts. In prosecution, one area that I believe needs to be re-energized is attention to ending impunity for traffickers. Human trafficking is a high reward, low risk crime, and traffickers know it. According to the TIP report, the leading global source of information about victim identification and prosecution, there's been a 42% drop in global prosecutions since 2015. De-emphasizing criminal accountability only allows traffickers to operate with impunity. We need all 3 Ps of the 3P paradigm. They're all essential aspects, and any efforts to delete or de-emphasize any P only benefits the traffickers. While traffickers face little risk of jail time, I am worried that you're more likely to be prosecuted as a trafficking victim than as a trafficker around the world. As you read various narratives in the TIP report, this issue is consistently raised and often forms the basis of a recommendation for improvement. Where convictions exist, we want to prioritize removing those offenses from victims' records so their traffickers' actions do not continue to prevent them from renting an apartment or getting a job. We must make good on our commitment to protect victims and assure the promise of non-penalization of victims becomes a reality. For the past 20 years, we have tested the provisions within the TVPA and its subsequent reauthorizations. And the good news is it works. We have identified some interventions and initiatives that serve as models to be emulated around the world. I would encourage you to consider ensuring the sustainability of the U.S. Advisory Council on Trafficking. The members of this council are essential guiding voices to the U.S. government efforts. We're also looking forward to the first report from the Public-Private Advisory Council to End Human Trafficking and its important contributions to the U.S. government's anti-trafficking efforts. And I strongly encourage you to extend their authorizations. Finally, the TIP Office's Child Protection Compact partnerships were originally authorized in 2013. These multi-year plans, developed jointly by the United States and a particular country, document the commitment of the two governments to achieve shared objectives aimed at strengthening the country's efforts to prosecute and convict child traffickers, to provide comprehensive trauma-informed care for child victims of these crimes, and to prevent child victims and child trafficking in all its forms. In 2016, Congress authorized the Program to End Modern Slavery to fund transformational projects in targeted jurisdictions to seek the reduction of prevalence of this crime. The Child Protection Compacts and the Program to End Modern Slavery funding are some of the most promising foreign assistance that the Trafficking in Persons Office administers. Thank you for putting freedom first by holding this hearing. I'm happy to answer your questions, and I look forward to our discussion.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your eloquent statement and, above all, for your very bold and effective leadership. I'd like to now yield to Director Chan.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me today to testify on the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I appreciate Congress's enduring bipartisan support of the federal government's efforts to combat and deter human trafficking. I'm Catherine Chan, the Director of the Office on Trafficking in Persons at the Administration for Children and Families. We are responsible for implementing the anti-trafficking authorities at the Department of Health and Human Services. Human trafficking is a violent crime, a grave human rights abuse, and a public health problem that disrupts the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. Between fiscal years 2001 and 2009, Congress appropriated $240 million for HHS to increase victim identification, provide services, and build local capacity to prevent and respond to human trafficking. HHS anti-trafficking programs have generally experienced year-over-year increases in the number of individuals certified, survivors assisted, and cases identified. Since 2001, HHS issued more than 9,500 certification and eligibility letters to victims of human trafficking. HHS grantees provided comprehensive services to more than 16,000 individuals. The HHS-funded National Human Trafficking Hotline identified more than 59,000 likely trafficking cases and 141,000 likely victims. The hotline made more than 120,000 service referrals and nearly 19,000 case reports to law enforcement. Promisingly, last year, there were more than 10,000 hotline signals directly from survivors of trafficking. 10 years ago, there were less than 200 signals directly from survivors. Public awareness and partnerships have contributed to the effectiveness of HHS anti-trafficking programs. Our public awareness campaign reached more than 61 million people and received more than 10 industry awards. The campaign will increasingly include prevention education messages to disrupt the effectiveness of common trafficking schemes by increasing knowledge, resiliency, and help-seeking behavior among high-risk populations and strengthening trauma-informed responses from potential bystanders. When emerging research showed that the majority of survivors interacted with healthcare providers while they were trafficked, HHS piloted the Stop, Observe, Ask, and Respond to Human Trafficking, or the SOAR training program in 2014. Since then, more than 9,600 healthcare professionals in 49 states and U.S. territories receive this training. As one indication of success, 94% of participants had high or very high confidence in their ability to respond to human trafficking after the training last year. And this is turning into action. For example, the National Human Trafficking Hotline received 1,500 signals from healthcare providers last year, compared to under 300 signals in 2013 before we piloted the training. That's a 5-fold increase. HHS also engaged in robust outreach to Native American communities on human trafficking and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Last year, we released a Tribal Youth Toolkit on human trafficking. We supported a human trafficking leadership cohort of Native American survivor leaders and allied professionals, and HHS funded the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center to develop resources to address human trafficking, domestic, and dating violence. We will be releasing a funding opportunity to address human trafficking in Native communities this year, along with a grant program on prevention education. Looking ahead, HHS will continue to put people, especially survivors, at the center of our mission. We will continue to leverage the power of data to understand trends in victimization, reduce the prevalence of trafficking, and identify opportunities for targeted prevention. This year, ACF will release a National Human Trafficking Prevention Action Plan outlining a strategy and issuing a call for partnerships, including projects to strengthen prevention education. Thank you for the opportunity to share this information about HHS's activities. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Director Chan. Thank you both. Just a few opening questions. Maybe, Director Chan, I can start with you. One of the things that we learned some years back was that most women who have been trafficked here in the United States, either into or intra, go to an emergency room, go to some kind of healthcare professional, and we know that there's been a major effort undertaken by your the Department of Health and Human Services and others to make sure that there is situational awareness training conveyed to those healthcare workers, and you have some numbers in here. I noticed that you also pointed out that the federally qualified health centers also, which is a huge set of contacts with people, are also so trained. And I wonder if you might elaborate on that, if you would. You also, if you could, with regards to victim identification and the hotline that is run so ably by Polaris Project, and Brad Miles was here. I don't know if he left, the former CEO, but I want to thank him for his service. But you have the numbers here of 141,000 likely victims of trafficking. 120,000 of those got service referrals, and 18,873 were reported to law enforcement. And you might give some insight as to why more are not reported to law enforcement. It is because the individual victim is fearful of coming forward, that she or he, but they're mostly women, feels that they'll be further brutalized if they become part of an action. And I'm wondering how that gap might be lessened so that that woman knows that she does have the full backing of our government and our prosecutors. Let me also just ask, if I could, about the issue of labor trafficking. Nia Misra will testify today about supply chains, and this would be to you, Mr. Ambassador, that global supply chains are tainted with forced labor. We've known that for a long time. We know that certainly some countries have passed laws. We don't have one, but we do have the law out of California that is very robust. But she makes the point that corporate responsibility codes and the like are bandages and window dressing. And I wonder if you might address how we might go so that our corporations are far more focused. I mean, I've chaired hearings in the past where we looked at what was going on in China with regards to some of the biggest corporations, and that some of these monitors who are sent over to check things out, in one case was paid, we believe, at least that's what the testimony was, to give a thumbs-up account as to how well that company was performing with regard to forced labor in China. And on China, if I could, Mr. Ambassador, we have a number of people here, including Rabia Kadir, one of the greatest human rights leaders for the Muslim Uyghur community. She has had her entire family and extended family, as have all 11 journalists at Radio Free Asia and their families, who do part of the Uyghur branch, and families throughout all of the Xinjiang region, gathered up and put into these terrible concentration camps where goods are made and many are exported to the U.S. and I wonder, or elsewhere. I just wondered if you could speak to that issue. I know the administration has spoken out very loud and clear on that. Number of corporations or entities have been put on the entities list. but I wonder how you might speak to that issue of this horrific imprisonment and forced labor of so many people. I remember back in the 1990s when we had an agreement with China, which I thought wasn't worth the paper was written on, for investigating instances of forced labor. And the Achilles heel to it, and I had a hearing on it, went over there and talked to the two customs people who were enforcing it. And those who might remember this old commercial, they were like the Maytag repairmen. They had no work because once we had what we thought was actionable information, you bring it to the Chinese government and then they investigate it and tell us what they find. Good luck getting an honest assessment from that. So I just would ask you if you could speak to that. And also on the issue of Cuba, I appreciate that the administration, the Bush administration put Israel and South Korea on the Tier 3 list. And it was a bold move, it was an honest move, and they did it because their record was deplorable. And over the course of a year, both of those countries moved mountains to get off. As you said, Mr. Ambassador, that bothers people to be on that list. When I first introduced this bill, I heard testimony from people who sat right where you're sitting right now from the previous administration, going back a few, this would have been the Clinton administration, who said that naming and shaming would be a negative thing. It would not yield results, and having a tip report, just put it as part of the country reports on human rights practices. That would be enough. And thankfully, in a bipartisan way, we overcame that opposition and were able to get the tip report and all the other aspects. But if you could speak to that issue, I would deeply appreciate it. When I say that issue, I mean Cuba, because I saw the information, or at least a lot of it, of how many on the labor side have been forced, compelled, coerced to go abroad, many of them healthcare professionals. They have no say. They are told when to go and how to do it. So my argument is that I don't care if you're a dictatorship on the right or the left or a flourishing democracy. If you have a problem with the exploitation of women and men and children, either sex or labor, we will be in your face fighting to change that and to stand with the victim and not the oppressed. Oppressor. Yes.
Right. Chairman Smith, thank you for your questions about our healthcare engagement. In fact, emergency room physicians have been at the forefront of addressing human trafficking, and we've consulted with them in the development of our SORTA Health and Wellness training program. There are, based on the successes that we've seen through this program, just a few months ago, we expanded access to this training to 1.8 million healthcare providers. And the way we're implementing that is in a few different ways. So, of course, we're working with our colleagues over at the Health Resource Services Administration in terms of the FQHCs and federally qualified health centers, grantees being more aware of human trafficking and participating in the SOAR training. But we've also entered into a number of public-private partnerships, namely with the American Hospital Association in their Hospitals Against Violence initiative. And then 3 state initiatives that I would like to bring up is just this last year, we worked with the state of Florida and their Department of Health and Public Health that has recently required nurses to receive training on human trafficking. We worked with the state of New Jersey, which passed legislation for all clinicians to receive training on human trafficking, and the HHS training is one of the on their approved list. And we're also working with the Children's Hospital of Atlanta and Georgia to strengthen their screening tools and protocols to better identify human trafficking. And then the final thing I would mention on this part is that the CDC recently updated their health diagnostic codes to, for the first time, collect data in healthcare settings on suspected and confirmed situations of both sex and labor trafficking. So we anticipate we'll have more data and information in future years in regards to the healthcare response to trafficking. And then in regards to the question about hotline referrals to law enforcement, there are a number of different reasons why there were about 19,000 case reports to law enforcement over the last several years. One, it really is up to the victim to decide when and whether to report their cases. And oftentimes they're looking for services first, and as they're getting stabilized, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has reporting and referral protocols, hundreds of them, with service providers as well as federal, state, local law enforcement. And then as part of those protocols, there are there's a threshold of information that law enforcement is looking for. And so depending on the type of case and the information that comes in, sometimes there may not be enough information to reach that threshold to make that report, but we'd be happy to get back to you on additional information on that.
Appreciate it. Mr. Ambassador.
Congressman, let me first start by thanking you for raising the issue of forced labor in China. Often, the forced labor element is at the end of a long litany of human rights abuses, and I appreciate you moving it to the forefront as we have this conversation about what China has been doing. We are deeply concerned as we continue to gather information, analysis, and do reporting on this. State-sponsored forced labor has intensified under China's mass detention and political indoctrination campaign against members of the Muslim ethnic minority. And authorities reportedly are subjecting a number of Tibetans as well and other ethno-religious groups to similar conditions. Our office has played an important role in an ongoing interagency effort to research, monitor, and raise awareness among industry partners and developments. We're concerned that well over 1 million people are being affected in this way, detained in the camps, and forced to work not just in the facility, in the detention facility, but forced to work in commerce, to create products that will ultimately be sold for profit. We are concerned consistently whenever we see state-sanctioned forced labor around the world. It is a different challenge, and it requires a different type of intervention than when a individual criminal or criminal syndicate operates. It requires tools of diplomacy and sanctions and engagement, and we are aware of the problems and working hard and join your frustration and concern with what has been going on. Turning to Cuba, I'd like to note that Cuba is ranked on Tier 3 in the Trafficking in Persons report this year. We have taken steps to call Cuba's attention to its human trafficking, including human trafficking in its overseas medical mission program. There have been indicators of human trafficking cases throughout that also are deeply concerning. We've been reporting on the problem in the medical mission program in the Trafficking in Persons report since 2010, and it has landed them, in part, that reason, among others, on Tier 3. We're deeply concerned that the Cuban government engages in forced labor for some of its nationals within Cuba as well as without. And we call on them to cease this practice. We want to make sure also that governments hosting Cuban physicians and nurses and other medical professionals take steps to investigate those potential forced labor cases. I'd also like to address your question about global supply chains. I do think that corporate responsibility codes and corporations' efforts to vet their supply chains are a helpful step forward, but they alone are not sufficient. We know that there are provisions provided by Congress in the Tvpa that are underutilized and could be used more. Specifically, I'd like to draw the attention to the benefiting financially provision of both 1589, the forced labor provision, as well as 1591, the sex trafficking provision. And it suggests that an individual or a company, even if they weren't engaged in the prohibited trafficking activities, if they know or are in reckless disregard and engaging in a venture where they benefit financially from a trafficking operation, they can be held criminally liable if there is sufficient proof. They can also be held civilly liable because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act provides a civil suit remedy. Benefiting cases are an opportunity, perhaps, to hold companies and corporations responsible. I'd also draw your attention to the encouraging use of the Department of Homeland Security's withhold and release orders, where they can issue against a company or a category of products a prohibition of importation of those goods into the United States if a standard is met that perhaps forced labor has been used in that. And we've seen a number of recent withhold and release orders that also have become the subject of much conversation in my engagement around the world as as countries are concerned about what this means. And what I encourage them is that what this means is that companies play an important role. They play an important partnership role as they want to get their supply chains clean as well. And so I think government working with industry to make sure that no laborers are forced to work and that no products that are tainted with forced labor enter into the market is a goal ahead as we turn this corner after the first 20 years and look into the future.
Co-Chair?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you both being here, and again, appreciate your work. And just to echo what Co-Chair Smith said about forced labor in China and the horrific conditions that the Uyghurs in particular are facing. I mean, it is, we both are on the China Commission, and we were in our recent report, we said that what is happening there could very well be crimes against humanity based on the horrific conditions, the camps in which people are being forced in. And you know, we mentioned the issue of companies and corporations benefiting directly or indirectly from that forced labor. I mean, I have to tell you, there are U.S. companies and U.S. corporations that are benefiting from forced labor in Xinjiang, and it is frustrating to me that. Despite the overwhelming evidence, that they can still do it. So we're also working on a forced labor bill that we're going to unveil in the not-too-distant future because, I mean, at the end of the day, we can do all the reports we want. We can rate countries, you know, in a particular way. We can issue press statements. We can hold hearings. But, you know, if that's it, then nothing's going to change. And so, you know, what is happening in China right now is, you know, is unconscionable. And, you know, and I just, let me ask you a couple of questions here. You know, I mentioned in my remarks that the Commission remains concerned about the risk of politicization of the TIP rankings, including India's Tier 2 ranking. Ambassador, could you please elaborate on the State Department's justification in that case?
Congressman, I appreciate the question because I think over the years there have been different concerns raised about whether there's political influence in the drafting of the Trafficking in Persons report and the establishment of the rankings. I can tell you that a country's ranking reflects the State Department's assessment of the government's efforts during the reporting period to meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking in persons. The Department strives to make the report as accurate and as objective as possible, documenting the successes and the shortcomings of all of government anti-trafficking efforts. The final tier decision is based on the anti-trafficking criteria spelled out in U.S. law and provided by the Tvpa. Our goal is to ensure that the TIP report is thorough in a fact-based assessment, and officials across the department work year-round to this end. Now, you mentioned a number of countries in your opening statement. The suggestion that our allies get, in a sense, preferential treatment, I would draw your attention to the fact that in the last 2 years, 6 of our European allies or strategic partners have been downgraded from Tier 1 to Tier 2, including allies like Germany and Italy. We have continued our effort to make sure and assess a fact-based determination. And so I want to be clear as we go forward that having seen the process last year during my first preparation of a TIP report, I was incredibly impressed by the hardworking professionals at the State Department, their focus on rigor and facts, and the analytical and professional approach that they took to their job. You mentioned India. India's ranking also looked at the whole of its anti-trafficking work. I'm aware of the concerns about mistreatment of individuals in India who have been institutionalized in Bihar State and the report regarding that. We know that there is a significant problem of individuals who are forced to work in what many call the bonded labor system. Indian government estimates that 8 million people suffer in bonded labor. There is a great deal of work to be done throughout India. We also note that where they have had some progress in investigation and prosecution and conviction, a reform in 2016 to the Bonded Labor Act that increased the number of rupees, or the number of compensation given to a victim, from 20,000 rupees to over 100,000. And in 2019, we saw for the first time an individual receive full compensation. They have made some steps, but the value of the analysis certainly takes all the factors into consideration in determining what the tier ranking should be.
No, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not here to. The whole of the work that you all do is very, very valuable, but I found it. And I understand why some countries are very clear. I think the situation in India continues to be of great concern. It's an ally, and we're going to have a great relationship with India, but there's a lot of suffering that is still going on, and that it just seems to me that it just seems that country stood out a little bit, and Qatar did as well. So the TVPA specifically imposes restrictions on aid to the governments of Tier 3 designated countries. Yet in 2019, the administration apparently interpreted the restrictions as applying more broadly to certain types of aid implemented by non-governmental organizations, including USAID implementers in Ebola-affected areas of DRC. So what is your interpretation of the statutory restrictions under the TVPA, and how were they intended to be applied? Because I understand the government restrictions, but these are non-governmental agencies doing important work, and I was just curious to get your reaction.
The Tier 3 restrictions that come when a country it fails to meet the minimum standards and doesn't make significant efforts to do so, and they're placed on Tier 3, include all non-humanitarian aid to that government. There's also a provision that indicates if a program is going to substantially benefit a government. There has been a shift in approach to the Tier 3 restrictions. For many years, the Tier 3 restrictions were often waived for most countries. That has changed, and now far few waivers are granted, which has also gotten the attention of many countries and increased the effectiveness of the report. We saw last year 10 countries receive full or partial waivers of their restrictions. Those restrictions are not to affect humanitarian, and they generally do not affect civil society, but when the civil society program has a substantial benefit to the government, those restrictions may apply.
And just finally to both of you, on balance, do you find that foreign governments' failure to combat human trafficking more often relates to lack of capacity or to insufficient political will and prioritization, or is it something else?
Congressman, I would say that it is all of those things. I think, and it varies depending on the country. Some countries may have the political will and low capacity. Other countries have a significant capacity and very little political will. I think it's a case-by-case determination in a country. What we want to do is come alongside as partners, not as Congressman Smith mentioned that some consider the report to name and shame. I consider it more to have an effective diagnostic measure of what is actually occurring. What are the facts? So that we can consider what the remedies and prescription to move forward are. We want to come alongside countries as a partner. We have had challenges ourselves, and we can share best practices from our mistakes as well as our successes. Certainly, our work to get comprehensive trafficking laws around the world has seen incredible progress. Our advocacy and our diplomacy, since the passage of the TVPA, the first comprehensive trafficking law, we have seen, I believe, almost 150 countries around the world create comprehensive statutes that are consistent with the first three minimum standards. We're going to continue to engage countries as partners on both their law as well as prosecution, prevention, and protection. And so I think it's capacity, it's political will, but it's also a partnership.
You have anything to add?
One thing I would add is that the TIP report, although it's mostly used for diplomacy purposes, domestically there is a U.S. narrative, part of the TIP report, and as a domestic-facing agency, the Department of Health and Human Services, we often meet with visiting delegations where the TIP report narrative for their respective countries provides a blueprint where we could share best practices, scale what's working, and share what we're doing in the U.S. that can help them in their respective homes.
And just one final thing. Congressman Smith and I have worked over the years on two pieces of legislation that I think it might be applicable here. One is the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act. It seems to me that the administration could more aggressively utilize that act, especially with regard to the trafficking issues we're talking about. You know, we talked about the Uyghurs and the terrible situation in Xinjiang. I mean, we know the person who should be sanctioned in that case. I mean, I'm not talking about denying President Xi the right to come to the United States or freezing all his assets, but there are people who are designing and implementing these policies. We know who they are, and I think if you really want to change behavior, we need to not only name and shame them, but also impose direct sanctions on those individuals. And so I would just say that's a tool I think is too underutilized that we can utilize even more. So I again appreciate your work, and I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Richmond, the DOJ was directed to create a model state anti-trafficking criminal statute in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Do you believe that this statute has been effective? And either way, how can it be improved?
Congressman, I appreciate your question. I know that there have been efforts afoot in terms of model state statutes. Many states have different configurations of their trafficking laws. I want to confess that I am not familiar with the details of the Department of Justice's work on that model statute, and defer to my colleagues at the Department of Justice who could provide you a more thorough answer.
State authorities are more likely to encounter instances of trafficking in the course of their local work on the ground. How can we in the federal government encourage states to implement robust policies enabling the investigation and prosecution of traffickers?
Congressman, one thing that we've seen be incredibly effective is where state and federal authorities partner from the very beginning. We've seen this in several different effective task force models. Congressman Smith mentioned one in his opening remarks. We've got a numerous and robust task force program around the United States where state authorities, local authorities, as well as the federal authorities are discussing not just how we can investigate, but also how we can make sure that when we're investigating a case, we're doing it in a victim-centered way so that we have services available for survivors immediately upon identification, and that we can take them through that process of the first few days with dignity and help them be stabilized. So I think there are some models, and it comes through partnership with the federal and state authorities from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any federal studies into the U.S. prison industrial complex where inmates in public and private prisons, both state and federal, work for less than $1 an hour producing products that are sold to consumers by American companies?
I'm not aware of any of those studies.
Thank you. Director Chan, and let me follow up on that. Can you imagine how that issue is definitely related to trafficking in individuals? In other words, the in and out nature of the criminal justice process, the fact that inmates are, rather than being coerced in the strict sense of the term, are incentivized to work for very, very low pay just to break the monotony of jail and or prison, and to maybe get a little extra credit so that they can get out early on their early sentence release, and how that process benefits private companies, for-profit companies, and how that, can you see how that relates to trafficking in individuals in any way?
Congressman, I don't know the specific cases. There are several suits, I think, that are active right now. I believe some civil suits on this topic, and I'm not familiar with the details of those suits. But I can tell you that the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that outlawed slavery has a provision in it that exempts the forced labor of convicts. And so if someone has been duly convicted of a crime, the law that the TVPA is predicated on, or our jurisdictional hook, does have that caveat. But I'd like to take that back and learn more about that.
In other words, slavery is permissible for someone who is serving a sentence for a crime under the 13th Amendment.
That wouldn't be the way I would categorize that, Congressman, but I would take this issue back and try to get more information for you.
Thank you. Director Chan, does the Office on Trafficking in Persons in HHS have a comprehensive strategy to protect foreign nationals in the United States? And if so, can you describe it?
Yes, we do have a comprehensive approach to supporting foreign national victims and survivors in the United States. Actually, our largest grant program at HHS on human trafficking is provides case management services to survivors of trafficking and their qualified family members. And then in the issuance of our certification and eligibility letters, we connect certain foreign national survivors are eligible for benefits and services to the same extent as refugees.
Is your department willing to commit to collaborate with immigrants' rights groups to develop a strategy to protect victims of trafficking?
We work with multiple diverse stakeholders, faith-based groups, community groups, many of the service providers providing comprehensive case management services to foreign national survivors of human trafficking work on are part of the immigrant advocacy field, and so they may be among our grantees. And then in addition to that, I referenced that we'll be working on a national human trafficking prevention action plan, which is also intended to be comprehensive for both foreign and domestic survivors of human trafficking. And we welcome collaboration with many organizations, including immigration organizations, to prevent and protect survivors of human trafficking.
Thank you. You're back.
Just a couple of follow-up and final questions. Dr. Chan, Laurie Cohen will be testifying shortly, and I know you know her, the executive director of ECPAC, and she points out that they work, especially with their YAC curriculum, Youth Against Child Trafficking, an Instagram campaign which trains educators and students on healthy relationship and online safety. I know you've had a number of meetings, and I was at least one of them and met with you previously. In implementing the Douglas Act, how quickly can we get all of these best practices, and they're out there. ECPAC has done it. Others have done, breathtaking, great work to protect our kids. But if it's not in the hands of the educators and of the children in an age-appropriate way, how do they defend themselves? Can you give us any sense, with this school year, this law passed a year ago, January. It was signed, I should say, a year ago, January. And I know you've had a number of very, very important, stakeholder meetings. When we can expect, when we first did the bill, I met with Kenneth Morris, the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. We named the bill after him because it was the 200th anniversary of his birth in 2018. I've read one of his autobiographies. It was just an amazing man, articulate, tremendous incisive writer, and a moral force. Well, it continues with his great-great-grandson as well. But the idea of having this curriculum is all important, and it's a best practice that I would hope and pray would be shared with our other partners, as the ambassador has pointed out. I would point out that, and I think, my good friend and colleague talked about political will and the absence of resources perhaps contributing. When we wrote the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act and prescribed minimum standards, we made it absolutely clear. We know that a lot of the bad apples here are government officials, starting with crooked police, prosecutors, mayors, all on the take, not all, but those who, so that's why the sanctions are directed at them as they are, prescribed in the bill. But if you could speak to that, I know you work with ECPAC. It's a tremendous organization. They also make the point, and you might want to speak to it, but it's more of an issue for the Justice Department that Sesta Foster obviously has done a great job with Backpage. But as she points out, there are a lot of smaller websites that now are filling in that gap, and unfortunately selling young women and children online again. So if you could, I mentioned cryptocurrencies in my opening comments. I wonder if you did want to speak to that or maybe get back to us, because that increasingly, and that's why we have a witness who will speak authoritatively to it. If you can't use dollars and can't use currency, credit cards, they go to the this other form of currencies. Ms. Konglim from the International Catholic Migration will speak to us later, and I've always believed that faith-based communities offer a tremendous, particularly in the victim side, when it comes to healing and reconciliation, because so many of the victims blame themselves. And I wonder if you might want to talk just briefly about the importance of faith-based, the faith-based community to this entire effort. As she points out in her testimony, in April of 2019, the Vatican hosted yet another conference, 200 attendees, and they had 695 recommendations. I mean, there's a lot of people in the secular and the faith-based community that keep coming up with greater and more effective ways of trying to combat this insidious evil. So, if you could, Director Chun.
So first, on the note of prevention education, last year we released a request for information from the public on effective prevention education programs. And thank you so much, Congressman Smith, for joining us at a roundtable on prevention education last year. We will be releasing our analysis of the review we've conducted since we've received information from multiple organizations, including ECPAT, and that will be coming out this spring. So there's information that will be coming out this spring. And then in regards to the grant opportunity authorized by the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Prevention Protection Act, that will also, there is a funding opportunity coming out this year, and that would go into effect this fall in time for the new school year. And on the question regarding faith-based organizations are grantees of ours. There's other stakeholders. Our regional offices have worked with many, including Catholic Charities in Louisville, on raising awareness about the importance of labor trafficking. They're working on migration and child protection issues all across the country, including along the southern border. So they're a critical partner in the fight against human trafficking.
Thank you.
Congressman, on your cryptocurrency question, I can share with you that the Trafficking in Persons Office has highlighted in the Trafficking in Persons report as an emerging issue and promising practice the use of technology. For example, in 2017 and 2018, the TIP report had featured sections focused on online sexual exploitation of children, as well as tracking specific financial flows. Cryptocurrencies and other emerging technologies present a new vulnerability and a challenge that enterprising traffickers can exploit. But they also present potential opportunities for people of goodwill and law enforcement to use them to try and detect where traffickers are operating. There are numerous groups that are working on trying to understand how these traffickers might be using cryptocurrencies and how law enforcement can approach those. This is an emerging area and one that we have to pay attention to and keep engaging on as we go forward. When it comes to faith-based groups, I appreciate your question because I think that part of getting this grand consensus that human trafficking is wrong, which is actually new in human history. For 4,000 years of history, we've had some form of trafficking in persons, and that was consistent. It was democratically approved a number of times. It has been culturally accepted and religiously endorsed. And that all changed in about 220 years ago when one by one countries started to pass laws to abridge the slave trade and then ultimately end slavery and now trafficking. We've seen a massive shift now that we have almost every country in the world has some sort of law against trafficking. Which, when I think about a timeline of history, like I studied in middle school, you'd have this long timeline of 4,000 years, and just last 220, we now have this grand legal consensus. Well, in 2014, faith leaders from every major religion gathered at the Vatican to declare that their sacred texts do not support trafficking. I think faith leaders in communities of faith have an important role just in establishing this principle of human dignity, that people should not be bought and sold. But they also have a role beyond creating that grand consensus. They have a role in making sure that victims are cared for. And they have a unique ability to do that because their programs and their projects are not limited by political terms or areas of responsibility or jurisdictional boundaries. They can operate across communities, countries, and regions, and they can operate on a much longer time horizon than governments can. And so I'm encouraged that faith communities have taken up the call to care for survivors, to provide trauma-informed care, to make sure that they encourage people who are growing up within those faith communities to pursue careers in justice, to pursue careers in diplomacy, to pursue careers in counseling, that these are noble professions that they could actually serve and care for folks as we go forward.
Thank you so much. I do just one follow-up to Catherine Chan. When that request for submissions goes out, how quickly can that be turned? Will we have something out before the beginning of the next school year? That
Yes.
schools can say, this is what we could do locally?
So the information that we've collected, that request went out last year, so we'll be putting it out for the public this spring. And so before the school year starts, there'll be a list of best practices or the most evidence-based practices that we could find so far on prevention education.
Thank you. I thank you both. Jeff,
Thank you.
thank you both for your tremendous leadership and for being with us today and sharing your wisdom. I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table. Begin with Laurie Cohen, who's the Executive Director of ECPAC USA, the leading organization in the U.S. on child sex trafficking and exploitation. An attorney, Ms. Cohen previously founded the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families in New York to provide legal, case management, and mental health services to victims of sex and labor trafficking. She has garnered international recognition for her work with both immigrant and domestic trafficking survivors, including and especially children. Ms. Cohen has drawn upon her experiences representing victims to advocate for policies at every level, state, local, and federal. She has conducted trainings in the U.S. and abroad for attorneys, prosecutors, judges, social service providers, healthcare professionals, and financial service providers, and has taught at Yale University and the University of Michigan Law School. Ms. Cohen is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. We'll then hear from Neha Misra, who joined the Solidarity Center in 1998 as the Deputy Country Program Director in Indonesia, where she managed the Solidarity Center's counter-trafficking in persons, labor, migration, and democracy programs. Before joining the Solidarity Center, she worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina on post-war elections and democracy, and in the U.S. as a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice. While at the Justice Department, she also served as the president of the American Federation of Government Employees, Local 3525. Neha serves on the executive board of Migration that works and represents the Solidarity Center with a test. We will hear then from Ms. Lin Yu Kong Glim, who is the head of the International Catholic Migration Commission, U.S. Liaison Office right here in D.C., founded in 1951. ICMC facilitates a worldwide network of national Catholic bishop conferences and other Catholic-inspired institutions responding to the needs of migrants, survivors of human trafficking, and refugees and displaced persons. She represents the International Catholic Migration Commission before the U.S.-based stakeholders. She traveled extensively throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean to better understand the needs of survivors of human trafficking and the need for frontline service providers to effectively advocate on their behalf. Then we'll hear from Liet Shetrit, did I say that right? Who's a senior advisor for crypto policy and regulation at Elliptic and an international strategic advisor for security and financial integrity and inclusion. For more than 15 years, she has led global capacity building and technical assistance programs on anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, financial inclusion, and countering violent extremism. She has formerly worked at the Edgemont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, Citicorp Bank, Citigroup, I should say, Global Center on Cooperative Security, and the U.S. House of Representatives Committee for Homeland Security. She has extensive experience implementing capacity building assistance programs, particularly in emerging markets in developing countries across Africa, the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East. Leanne holds a Master of International Affairs degree from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a BA in Political Science and Psychology from the University of Illinois. She is also a certified anti-money laundering specialist. So welcome all four of you to this panel. And Ms. Cohen, if you could begin with your testimony.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and members of this commission, on behalf of ECPAT USA, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I am honored to have been asked to speak about the progress made to protect children from sex trafficking and exploitation, and how Congress can work to eliminate these horrific crimes in the months and years ahead. Before I begin my remarks, first, let me thank you, Chairman Smith, for your courage. 20 years ago, you recognized human trafficking as an insidious evil that was flourishing in plain sight. Because of your determination to expose and abolish this abuse, you authored the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. As a result of your leadership, federal departments, including the Departments of State, Health and Human Services, Justice, Labor, and Homeland Security, are enforcing laws to protect victims against this heinous crime. You have traveled the world, urging countries to adopt laws that prohibit human trafficking, and you have been the strongest ally in Congress for abolitionist organizations like ECPAT USA. The fact is, Mr. Chairman, countless lives have been saved because of your courage and the landmark law that you penned. As ECPAT USA's executive director, I spend every day fighting to end the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Our talented staff partners with a wide range of stakeholders to develop programs and policies that safeguard kids. We do this through our Youth Against Child Trafficking, or YAC curriculum, and our Instagram campaign. And I'd like to enter these into the record, please, which trains educators and students on healthy relationships and online safety, as well as the signs of exploitation and trafficking. We do this through ECPAT's Code of Conduct, a set of tools that the travel and tourism industries have adopted to prevent child trafficking. And we also do this through our work with Congress, advocating for laws that protect our kids while holding exploiters accountable. In addition to providing guidance on the reauthorization of the latest TVPA signed into law, as you noted, 1 year ago, ECPAT USA worked tirelessly for the passage of SESTA-FOSTA, which, as you well know, clarified that websites could no longer knowingly facilitate sex trafficking through online advertising. Tragically, prior to the passage of SESTA-FOSTA, children who had been sold for sex through websites such as Backpage.com found that they had no legal protections, as was movingly depicted in the documentary I Am Jane Doe. The enactment of this law, which had near unanimous bipartisan support in Congress, removed the loophole protecting online predators, leading to the immediate closure of some websites and a significant drop in the demand for commercial sex. That said, online predatory abuse will continue if Congress does not act. While SESTA-FOSTA shattered the online behemoths that sold kids for sex, the Department of Justice needs more support so that it can vigorously go after smaller sites that have resurfaced, operating with apparent impunity. Additionally, there are some who want to weaken the law or have it overturned altogether because of provisions that penalize the demand for sex. This can't happen. Mr. Chairman, let me be clear. Without strong enforcement of SESTA FOSTA and a renewed focus on ending demand, children will continue to suffer horrific abuse, the scars of which will never heal. SESTA FOSTA exposed a terrifying reality. Online sex trafficking is a billion-dollar-a-year business driven by the demand to purchase young, vulnerable bodies. We know that this demand has evolved to include related forms of sexual exploitation of children, including infants and toddlers. Recently, the Department of Justice held a summit that addressed the epidemic of child sexual abuse materials known as CSAM. In 2018, 45 million pieces of content, including images, videos, and chat of children were reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Mr. Chairman, I'm mentioning this because laws like SESTA FOSTA must be expanded to give the Justice Department the resources necessary to interpret these images, to intercept these images. Mr. Chairman, we've come a long way since you first authored the Tvpa 20 years ago. As traffickers, which not only include pimps and brothel owners, but also buyers, continue to evolve and expand their online presence, we must continue to ensure that the next reauthorization of the Tvpa provides the necessary laws and funding to thwart anyone who would dare to sexually exploit our youngest citizens and the future of our nation. Thank you again. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for your kind words, but thank you for being part of the team all these many years, because it does take the team to get it all done. Thank you. Ms. Muir?
Thank you. Co-Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission, thank you for this opportunity to present the Solidarity Center's reflections on 20 years of efforts to address labor trafficking globally. The Solidarity Center is the only U.S.-based international non-governmental organization that promotes and protects worker rights globally. We're particularly thankful to the two co-chairmen of this commission for all of the work that you've done to address forced labor globally. When you're in the midst of doing this work for many years, like I have, sometimes it's easy to focus on the challenges that we face and not take the time to reflect on the progress. So I really appreciate this opportunity to take some time to reflect on where we've come after 20 years of the Tvpa. And I realized as I was thinking about this that there has been a lot of progress over the past 2 decades. There are significantly more resources dedicated to combating the problem from the public and private sectors. We have much more clear definition of human trafficking and understanding the scope of the issue. The U.S. government and governments around the world have passed more laws to combat trafficking, and we are more knowledgeable about the underlying root causes of and vulnerabilities to human trafficking. And we've also had some recent successes in using trade policy to combat forced labor, which I'll talk about later. We're now at a point, however, where we must address some of the more difficult and structural challenges that are sometimes harder to confront. Specifically, there's a fundamental need to change how labor migration is managed around the world, how companies do business, and how governments monitor and enforce human and labor rights. On labor migration, we know that there are structural and institutionalized systems that have been created to manage migration that specifically increases workers' vulnerability to human trafficking. Even workers in regular migration programs where oversight is theoretically stronger, such as guest worker or temporary migration schemes, including cultural exchange programs such as those for au pairs, can face conditions of debt bondage, involuntary servitude, and forced labor through high recruitment fees that leave them indebted, having their visas tied to a particular employer, and threats of forcing workers out of status and into deportation. It is our experience working in 60 countries over more than 20 years that to address migrant worker and refugee vulnerability to trafficking, we need to level the playing field when it comes to rights and enforcement of rights of people living and working in a country. All workers, regardless of status, whether nationals or foreign, whether documented or undocumented, whether fleeing conflict or seeking family supporting wages, whether in the informal or formal economy, should be treated equally when it comes to internationally recognized workplace rights and the ability to exercise them. In terms of global supply chains, we know that human trafficking thrives in a context of private actors and economic coercion. We must exert economic pressure as a response and recognize the protection of worker rights as a key to trafficking prevention. We also must reject policies and practices that restructure and institutionalize harmful economic and business models that increase workers' vulnerability to human trafficking. Solidarity Center staff from around the globe could tell you story after story of workers we encounter every day who are simply trying to provide for themselves and their families and instead end up facing horrific exploitation due to the way governments and businesses structure work and fail to uphold rights. We could tell you the story of 14 Burmese migrant workers in Thailand who were charged with criminal defamation for filing a complaint against their employer with the National Human Rights Commission. The workers alleged that their employer on a chicken farm had subjected them to grueling work conditions, including forced labor. And instead of justice, these workers faced retaliation for daring to stand up. I could tell you story after story like that in every country of the world that involves global supply chains. There's greater recognition today of the role of the private sector in perpetuating forced labor. There is acknowledgement that products made with forced labor are ending up on our grocery and retail shelves. Where we have less agreement or less action is in how to address this problem. We must move beyond simple transparency to accountability, requiring companies to undertake due diligence to detect and address forced labor risks in supply chains in a meaningful way. As you mentioned earlier, Representative Smith, I had noted in my written testimony that corporate social responsibility approaches have largely proved to be band-aids or window dressing. Non-binding codes of conduct, certification schemes, and third-party auditing do not work. There's study after study that shows that. We need to move away from corporate social responsibility to worker-driven corporate accountability, providing support for workers to express their agency and have representation in their workplace. Freedom of association and collective bargaining are a key way to do that. From rubber plantations in Liberia to garment factories in Jordan, the Solidarity Center has seen time and time again how democratic worker organizing and collective bargaining can eliminate forced labor in a workplace. Companies must also rethink their business practices and move away from subcontracting or outsourcing human resources management responsibilities to employment agencies and labor recruiters. They must stop demanding cheap or unrealistic pricing from suppliers that leads to pressure to squeeze worker wages. And companies must also require strict adherence to core labor standards, including the freedom of association and prohibition on recruitment fees, and impose a zero tolerance policy on suppliers. And finally, just to say that we've made some progress in the trade realm. The Solidarity Center and others have been advocating for years for government to use trade restrictions and import bans and other penalties on products made with forced labor. In fact, I testified before this committee 5 years ago advocating for the removal of the consumptive demand loophole in the Tariff Act. And I'm really happy to say that I think a year after, it wasn't because of my testimony, but a year after that Congress did remove the consumptive demand loophole in the Tariff Act. And we are seeing the benefits of that today. Both of you, Congresspeople, earlier in the earlier panel mentioned the forced labor that's going on in the Xinjiang province of China. And one of the things that I think that we need to do in order to address that is have more withhold and release orders against companies that are profiting from the forced labor in that region. As you know, CBP issued a WRO in October for 5 countries, and one of them was related to a company producing garments in that region of China. That's one in about 10,000 more that we need. I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, sorry, just one thing I wanted to mention. You had also asked a question in the earlier panel about the Tier 3 sanctions and the new interpretation that is going in place in that, on that. And I wanted to mention that we've had small programs, the Solidarity Center specifically, in Laos and Burma, that have been affected by this new interpretation of the Tier 3 sanctions. And while we are strong supporters of economic and trade sanctions as a way to push for better action on forced labor, we do not think that that was what Congress intended when you passed the TVPRA and the sanctions regime within it, and that a civil society programming such as ours that expands democracy and human rights in a country is exactly the type of programming that you want have going on in a Tier 3 country. And unfortunately, our programs have been affected. Thank you so much.
Your testimony. And now, Ms. Kong Ling.
Thank you to Chairman and Governor, Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission for hosting this hearing on the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The passing of the TVPA under the leadership of Congressman Smith was monumental in 2000, but still 20 years later, victims, survivors, and those at risk of human trafficking remain in need of protections afforded by this critical piece of legislation. The International Catholic Migration Commission is honored to receive this invitation to testify at this hearing to further highlight the importance of this bill, as well as the critical role that faith-based actors play in protecting communities and individuals at risk. ICMC was founded in 1951 to promote networking among Catholic-inspired organizations responding to the needs of migrants, refugees, and displaced persons, as well as to advocate at a global level on their behalf. ICMC currently has staff and programs in nearly 50 countries serving vulnerable populations regardless of their faith, race, ethnicity, and nationality. Since 1999, ICMC has worked in partnership with local organizations to prevent and respond to human trafficking, provide direct assistance to survivors, conduct international advocacy on behalf of those most vulnerable to human trafficking, and train border officials to strengthen identification of trafficked victims and increase prosecution of traffickers. We continuously and actively engage with our faith-based partners to ensure that the needs of affected communities are identified and appropriate services are sought. The work of ICMC is inspired by the Holy Bible as well as the ongoing teaching and tradition of the Catholic Church. And thus, we're deeply inspired and guided by Pope Francis, who has really prioritized the church response to human trafficking. Congressman Smith, thank you for noting the conference that was held in the Vatican. Over 200 individuals were there from Catholic organizations as well as trafficking experts. And as the Pope has so eloquently said, we're facing a global phenomenon that exceeds the competence of any one community or country. And therefore, we need mobilization comparable in size to that of the phenomenon itself. And as such, ICMC remains committed to building on our history and that of the Catholic Church to ensure that the needs of men, women, boys, and girls who are victims of human trafficking or otherwise at risk are fully realized and holistically addressed. The TVPA has provided a policy framework that prioritizes the protection of those who have been unjustly exploited, and it's within the same spirit that faith-based actors are invaluable partners in these efforts. Churches and other religious institutions are stalwarts within their communities. They actually embody the word community and remain present with or without the support of local or international donors. Faith-based actors are often inherently first responders through the physical presence of the church, the support centers run by religious congregations, and the members who encounter individuals in need of support. Often, when people are in trafficking situations, church is the first place that they turn, and sometimes the only place that they're allowed to access. The value and scope of faith-based actors as long-term and sustainable partners in the fight against human trafficking cannot be underestimated. And consistent with this theme, ICMC welcomes the engagement of the TIP office of faith-based groups for input into its annual Trafficking in Persons report. We regularly receive the request to provide information. We share that with our partners, and we also share information to the best of our ability. And within the report, there's a consistent acknowledgement of the role of faith-based organizations in serving victims. It's even highlighted in many country narratives that faith-based organizations are the primary service providers and not governments. This is a testament to the efforts of the Catholic Church and other faith-based actors in professionalizing the work. I think many times we're recognized as being clergy or lay leaders and not as professional actors, but we're made up of social workers, teachers, health practitioners. Organizations such as ICMC, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Caritas International, to name a few, have provided both organizational and technical assistance to enhance the response of local actors, specifically grassroots organizations that live within vulnerable communities and often have the best access. Our work is firmly rooted in protection of life and human dignity, and we recognize that human dignity violates the dignity of the person, and thus our commitment to this work is value and not profit-driven. For this reason, it is critical that faith-based actors receive greater consideration as implementing partners and not just as suppliers of information. In continuous service to their communities, faith-based partners also seek to consistently understand and address root causes of human trafficking, as well as barriers to protection for survivors. Service to communities is survivor-centered, and it seeks the full restoration, not just return, but the holistic restoration and reintegration of survivors back into their community. Many of the frontline service providers that I've met with often reiterate the importance of community and familial engagement when implementing prevention and response programming. While as practitioners and policymakers, many of us oppose narratives that promote victim blaming, we know that many survivors can be met with shame in their communities, especially if they've been sexually exploited, forced to commit gross atrocities, or forced into trafficking situations to reduce financial burdens on their families. In a recent meeting hosted by ICMC in Bangkok last month, church partners exchanged best practices and challenges in preventing and responding to human trafficking in the Asia and Oceania region. ICMC member organization Caritas Bangladesh shared the plight of street children who are extremely vulnerable and often victims of trafficking. Bangladesh has over 1.5 million street children under the age of 14, the majority migrating to the capital city from rural areas throughout the country. Most survive begging, hawking small goods, dealing drugs, prostitution, and other exploitative means. Caritas Bangladesh provides the children with clothing, shelter, sanitary supplies, healthcare, schooling, vocational training, and psychosocial support. However, one of the greatest challenges they face is reunifying children with their families, even after they are found, because many ended up on the streets due to parental pressure to provide income. In cases such as these, faith-based actors, especially religious leaders, can play a unique and influential role by not only protecting victims, but also combating harmful practices within their communities. So in closing, I thank the Commission for engaging multiple stakeholders on such an important issue. It's inspiring to participate in a hearing with governmental, non-governmental, and faith actors all committed to a single cause, combating human trafficking. We look forward to furthering these joint efforts in the years to come in coordination and partnership with the U.S. government and other stakeholders with shared values and commitments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and for the great work you're doing. Ms. Shepard.
Good afternoon, Co-Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman Smith, members of the Commission. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. I'm honored and privileged to be here on this 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. My name is Liat Chatret. I'm the Senior Advisor for Crypto Policy and Regulation at Elliptic, a provider of cryptocurrency anti-money laundering tools. We equip the world's leading financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses with the software and insights they need to identify and act upon illicit cryptocurrency transactions, including those associated with human trafficking. We also work with law enforcement agencies in the US and around the world, helping them to investigate criminal activity involving the use of cryptocurrency. Human trafficking is one of the most heinous types of criminal activities, exploiting some of the most vulnerable in society. It is also one of the most lucrative. Over the past decade, the proceeds generated by human trafficking have soared from $30 billion to over $150 per year. The large sums involved provide law enforcement with the opportunity to work with financial institutions to detect trafficking through distinctive patterns in financial transactions. These patterns have been used to identify perpetrators and victims of human trafficking for sexual exploitation. For example, based on unusual and sustained expenditure on travel, accommodation, or sustenance. The proceeds of this activity must also be reintroduced into the financial system, and transactions indicative of money laundering can be used to identify human trafficking and follow the money from lower-level operatives to the greater criminal enterprise. Human traffickers use a variety of techniques to mask their activities when engaging in these transactions. These include the use of online payments, prepaid cards, informal banking systems, anonymous shell companies, and real estate transactions. Human trafficking is an agile criminal enterprise constantly adapting to the regulatory environment, the capabilities of law enforcement, and the new technologies at their disposal. Over the past few years, cryptocurrency has been one of these new technologies that human traffickers have begun to exploit. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin can be thought of as digital cash. Like cash, they have properties that make them attractive to criminals, such as the lack of a central authority that can block those transactions or seize funds. There is also the perception that cryptocurrency transactions are anonymous, that they're untraceable, although this is not entirely true. In a small number of known cases, criminals have exploited these characteristics, and cryptocurrencies have been used to facilitate human trafficking. In 2015, Visa and MasterCard cut off payment services to Backpage.com, the largest online marketplace for buying and selling sex in the US, leaving it unable to accept payments from those purchasing ads on its platform. In response, Backpage turned instead to accepting payments in Bitcoin, assuming that they could not be prevented from doing so. In 2018, the co-funders and others associated with Backpage were indicted, accused of earning hundreds of millions of dollars from facilitating prostitution and sex trafficking. Until early 2018, Welcome to Video was the largest child sexual exploitation market on the dark web. It sold access to 250,000 videos portraying child sexual abuse, which were downloaded over 1 million times. Payment was accepted in Bitcoins, presumably to make it difficult to trace the transactions of the buyers and sellers of the material and identify them. However, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin are not, in fact, anonymous. Transactions take place between wallets and are identifiable through their address, which is similar to an account number. The blockchain ledger behind a cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, lists the details of all transactions between these addresses, including the sending and receiving wallets. Blockchain analytic techniques have been developed by Elliptics and others to link these addresses to real-life identities. Tools based on these techniques are used by law enforcement agencies in the US and elsewhere to trace proceeds of crime and identify victims and perpetrators. In fact, these tools were used in both the Backpage and Welcome to Video cases that I've just described. Law enforcement used blockchain analytics to help identify and bring to justice the buyers and facilitators of human trafficking for sexual exploitation. Huge strides have been made in combating all types of financial crime and cryptocurrencies over the past decade, both through the development of law enforcement capabilities and through regulation. It is important to take note of these efforts and their achievements. In 2013, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, issued guidance stating that certain types of cryptocurrency businesses, including exchanges, would be treated as money transmitters and were subject to the requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act. This obligates them to aid government agencies in detecting and preventing the laundering of the proceeds of criminal activity against including human trafficking. The regulatory regime for anti-money laundering in the US holds cryptocurrency businesses to the same standard as comparable traditional financial institutions and has helped to deny criminals a means to cash out their proceeds. In fact, our analysis shows that in 2019, less than 0.5% of all Bitcoin transactions were associated with the purchase of illicit goods or services on the dark web. We expect to continue to see this fall. However, some risks do remain. First, cryptocurrency does not respect borders. It's very easy for criminals to cash out or launder funds by sending them to an exchange overseas that does not perform anti-money laundering checks. Anti-money laundering regulations must be applied globally in order to be truly effective. The recent work of the Financial Action Task Force is a good first step towards this. The U.S. delegations to the Financial Action Task Force, the Egmont Group, and other international forums have a central role to play in advocating for the adoption, implementation, and application of the June 2019 FATF guidance on virtual currencies around the globe. To that end, Congress should ensure that attention is drawn to jurisdictions that fail to implement the FATF guidance on the regulation of cryptocurrency service providers. Through its mutual evaluation process, the FATF will soon begin to publish information about whether and how effectively countries are implementing its cryptocurrency standards. Based on that information, Congress should call for accountability from those countries that the FATF finds are imposing inadequate measures. Secondly, a new type of cryptocurrency, collectively known as privacy coins, has emerged. Privacy coins are far less traceable than the likes of Bitcoin. Indeed, tools allowing law enforcement or financial institutions to trace payments and privacy coins simply do not exist. At Elliptic, we respect every individual's right to financial privacy, and privacy coins have societal value to add, especially for the millions of people living under authoritarian or corrupt regimes. However, they are also being exploited by criminals, with the majority of dark marketplaces now accepting one or more privacy coins as a payment option. Regulators should ensure that cryptocurrency businesses that support privacy coins enforce anti-money laundering policies that are appropriate to the lack of traceability inherent to them. In May 2019, FinCEN issued a guidance on cryptocurrencies that importantly stated that businesses handling privacy coins are not exempt from anti-money laundering requirements merely because privacy coins are impossible to trace. However, because transaction tracing solutions are unavailable for privacy coins, cryptocurrency businesses require additional guidance from regulators specifying the types of controls, measures that they should apply to transactions in privacy coins. There remains continuing confusion amongst cryptocurrency businesses as to how or whether they can handle privacy coins while meeting regulatory expectations. To that end, Congress should call on FinCEN to issue additional guidance providing further clarity on its expectations of U.S. cryptocurrency businesses that enable the use of privacy coins. Any additional guidance should also clarify that U.S. cryptocurrency businesses should deploy tracing solutions for any coins they offer where those solutions exist. Congress can also play an important role in this effort by soliciting future testimony from experts on the risks presented by privacy coins specifically, offering a forum for discussion on appropriate policy and regulatory responses. Finally, the boundary between cryptocurrency and traditional finance is beginning to blur. Knowingly or not, banks and other financial institutions are enabling the movement of funds into or out of cryptocurrency. This may involve cryptocurrency exchanges in jurisdictions where anti-money laundering regulations do not yet apply to cryptocurrency businesses, and which may be enabling the laundering of criminal activities such as human trafficking. Financial institutions in the U.S. must do better at assessing whether they are exposed to this kind of activity, implement adequate measures aligned with a risk-based approach, which begins with their own institutional risk assessments. Congress should insist that U.S. banking regulators and banks undertake additional efforts to mitigate mainstream financial sector exposure to cryptocurrency-related risks. This should include calling on U.S. banking regulators to issue formal guidance, clarifying their expectations that U.S. banks must be able to identify and manage cryptocurrency risk exposure, direct or indirect, to them. Congress should also convene future hearings to explore the role that banks can play in preventing cryptocurrency-related risks and to insist on accountability from banks in managing those risks. Cryptocurrencies have the potential to create a secure, open financial system that will promote innovation, competition, and access to financial services around the world. However, it can take time for law enforcement capabilities and financial regulation to catch up with new financial innovations. In the interim, these technologies can be open to criminal exploitation, including by human traffickers. This has been the case with cryptocurrencies, and challenges still remain. But in the U.S., we now have powerful tools and a strong regulatory framework in place, which will help to ensure that the activity can be detected and prevented. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today, and I welcome your questions and follow-up.
Thank you very much for that excellent testimony. Let me ask you a question, if I could follow up on what you just said about the second type of cryptocurrency known as privacy coins, and that there's no way of tracing payments in those coins. It doesn't exist. Is that worldwide? I mean, has the Chinese government, which obviously has become the surveillance state on steroids, have they come up with a way of breaking that? And you do point out that, you know, there is a positive side that for millions of people living under authoritarian, corrupt regimes, but if it facilitates crime, organized crime and the like, why not just outlaw it? Or would that be too, I mean, does the negative outweigh the positive? And you know, one thing that we've done with various reauthorizations of the TPVA, and we do it on a lot of other laws, is that when we look at what organized crime or gangs or others are doing, we try to get one step ahead of them. We seem to be 5 steps behind when it comes to cryptocurrencies. And I'm wondering, you know, when you mentioned how there needs to be more resources, does that mean a new law, or does that mean more resources devoted to the effort that's already underway? who is really leading this? Justice Department? Please.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for that questions. I'll take them one by one, and I hope I don't miss one. With regards to the privacy coins, the privacy element is inherent to the new technologies, right? So it's built into the actual application, into the actual blockchain underlying. So the technology is private, whether you're utilizing it from the United States, from China, from Russia, wherever you'd like to see it. So at the moment, that's where it's at, and it varies across a variety of different coins. With that, and on the note of China, I think it's important to note that where we have been effective is by Bitcoin wallets owned by Chinese nationals, which have been sanctioned for trafficking fentanyl into the U.S. So there are real good examples in which we have abilities to intercept and interdict and really utilize some of our existing regulatory frameworks to get in the middle of this. And I think also China is very much in advanced stages of developing its own digital currency and is innovating. And it's important to understand that the more legislation we add to our own U.S. structures here, we might in fact be coming up with an unintended consequence of inhibiting our own innovation here in the United States and potentially shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to developing globally against competitors who are moving forward and fast, quickly and fast. In this sense, part of the issue relates to dissemination of the tools that are available. Do the right people have blockchain analytic tools? Do financial institutions have them? Law enforcement agencies, federally and also at the state level? And at the moment, the answer is broadly mixed because the tools exist. The softwares are out there. Elliptic, others are offering them. They're on the market. The issue is, are the right entities and agencies, do they have access to them? Have they purchased them? Have they incorporated policies and procedures around them? And this goes back to questions of conducting risk assessments. Every financial institution should be managing a risk assessment, including for crypto direct or indirect exposure.
The Financial Action Task Force, founded in 1989, and I know there are many throughout the world. Are they advisory only? Do they make recommendations for legislation to countries?
Thank you for that. So the Financial Action Task Force is a global norm-setting body. It's an intergovernmental body made up of member states, and its membership is very much what dictates what the day-to-day agendas are. And the FATF guidance in June 2019 really put out a comprehensive international standard about how we should be looking at virtual assets and virtual asset providers, so they're called VASPs. And the way that we treat VASPs on the international standard level is primarily a guidance and a very high-level overview of what different countries and jurisdictions should then do by way of adopting that guidance and enacting it into the national levels and into legislation. In the U.S., we are very much ahead of this. We're sort of considered well aligned with FATF standards, and the biggest challenge is that when we deal with counterparts and stakeholders overseas, we don't often meet the same type of rigor or framework on anti-money laundering, counterterrorism finance. So if you think about cryptocurrency being cross-border and global, the movement of crypto from one regulated, effectively balanced country to another just means that we're losing visibility because there's no kind of stakeholder counterpart on the other side. So it's more about evening out the playing field. The United States was the president of the FATF last year and had handed over the presidency, which rotates every year, to China, which is the president this year, until the end of June.
I'll ask my questions to all of our panelists, one by one, if you could just answer it. Ms. Conglin, thank you for your emphasis on the importance of the faith-based community, longstanding as it has been, providing an enormous amount of support for people who have been horribly mistreated. I've actually been in trafficking shelters all over the world, Russia, Peru, Ethiopia, Bolivia, Romania, DR Congo, which was more of a sexual assault center. All of them were faith-based. I've been in the secular base, and I have nothing but respect for the great work that they do as well. But I was struck, including in DR Congo, how women who had been so horribly mistreated and raped and assaulted, it was their faith and the nourishment that came from that, the sense of reconciliation that was helping them to get their lives back together. So if you could speak to that important component that all faiths can provide to someone who has been so cruelly mistreated. On Ms. Misra, your many points I thought were really important. All of your recommendations, I think we got to look those up and follow up on those because there were so many, but they were very, very good. Supply chains continues to be a huge problem, and as you pointed out, there are two countries that have a very good law. I don't know how well it's being implemented, and we had one in California. We have one, I should say, and we certainly should have one here. And I've co-sponsored that bill for years, and we're thinking of reintroducing it, and I think you made some good recommendations on how it ought to be stronger, and I thank you for that. You might want to speak further on that, if you would. Let me also ask you, the Tier 3 designation of China under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, should the administration issue a WRO on all production and manufacturing of cotton, for example, from Xinjiang? I'll never forget when Turkmenistan was on the Tier 3 list, a former ambassador at large came and testified and says, let me put this in perspective. Cotton, slavery, United States, Turkmenistan, cotton, slavery. And everybody in the room, like a light bulb went off, but of course. And that's why they had designated Tier 3 for that country, Turkmenistan. Should we be looking at broader categories, saying, okay, no cotton coming in from Xinjiang pursuant to that Tier 3 rating and the terrible exploitation that's happening there. Dr. Laurie Cohen, if you could, ECPAC did some groundbreaking work on how young boys are so horribly exploited. It's been backed up by several other studies. We rarely hear about it. Anyone exploited, male or female, cries out for our intervention with no holds bars. But I think it often gets underappreciated. Matter of fact, the quote, I don't have it in front of me, but there was a statement that your ECPAT had made regarding that. If I could just find it real quickly. I don't have it. But it just said that, it continues to be under-recognized. And finally, I had met with Lieutenant Pizzoro of New Jersey's commander of the Internet Crimes Against Children, and he explained to me something that I very much underappreciated and knew of, and that was that app-based technology that does not require age verification, that children increasingly are lured by predators and misled into self-producing porn, and these are children as young as 7 and 8, and that app is the conduit to this terrible exploitation that often goes to even worse exploitation. If you would speak to that. And on the issue of the curriculum and best practices for our elementary and secondary school children, are you confident that HHS will pull together? I know you're feeding into that with your tremendous expertise, with a best practices that could be something that's off the shelf that educators and then the people they serve, the children, will be well served by. This is what you got to look out for, so that, forced fraud or coercion, the fraud is so often a part of it. The fact that young women and girls or boys have no idea what awaits them out there until they're exploited, often drugged, and then, as your organization has pointed out for so long, and NCMEC and all the others. So, yes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I'd like to reiterate the point that you made about traveling all over the world and finding faith actors no matter where you go. I often tell people the story of when I first traveled to Central African Republic back in 2008. At that time, I was working for a secular organization. We were doing a humanitarian assessment mission and ended up in a location where there was no housing for us, and we had to spend the night. And we went to a nun's house, and she opened the doors, she fed us, she found a room for us to sleep, and she didn't know she was coming, but she provided what she could. And that's the same sentiment that you'll find with faith organizations globally. If they can serve, they will serve. And I want to highlight a few things. Service is indiscriminate. I think that sometimes people assume that faith organizations will only serve those that are of their faith, and that's absolutely not true. As Catholics, we not only serve every faith, but I also have individuals of every faith that work with me on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's really important. I also want to highlight the holistic nature of our service. I think, at times we know that trafficking survivors will be provided with a really short-term package or a repatriation back to the capital, not necessarily where they're actually from. But that's not enough, right? So if we're talking about true holistic restoration of someone to be able to restart their lives, they're going to need psychosocial support. They're going to need more long-term shelter. They're going to need food assistance, clothing assistance, vocational training. I mean, the list goes on. And what you'll find is that faith actors, they take that seriously. They're looking at the holistic restoration of the person, and they do their best to serve them from beginning to end. And that includes, us supporting children that sometimes people may come back with that they didn't leave with, which often is what the barrier is for them to return to their homes. And then the last thing I want to highlight is the global network of faith actors. So I mentioned earlier one of many conferences that the Pope has hosted at the Vatican that attracted actors from all over the globe. But you'll see that when you speak to actors, they talk about repatriating or reunifying survivors that are in Europe back to their homes in Nigeria, in the Middle East, in Southern Africa. So there's this network that I think that we can underestimate, and the ability to connect stakeholders as well as people back to their homes that I think is really, really important. So thank you.
So much. Thank you, Congressman. I wanted to note one thing that's really important too is that there's been a long history of labor and faith-based groups working together, and we were just commenting that one of the first anti-trafficking projects that I ever worked on in the year 2001 was in Indonesia, and it was a partnership with ICMC with the Solidarity Center. So we have a long history of labor and faith-based working together. On your two questions related to Tier 3 and the withhold and release orders and other things, just more generally, we were really happy to see the work of the WRO on Turkmenistan cotton, because I think there are times when there is forced labor so much in an industry that you should go after the entire sector and not just a particular company. On the case of China and Xinjiang, which I'm pronouncing incorrectly, I think, but it's a little complicated because cotton from Xinjiang is turned into textiles, which are then transformed into garments, not only in China, but throughout Asia. And so in order to stop goods made in whole or in part from forced labor means going after more than just cotton exported from China, which is little, but also the massive textile and apparel supply chain, which has its roots in Xinjiang in the cotton industry. And that's another thing that we have been advocating to CBP for, is not only withhold and release orders on a particular commodity, but anything that is made from a commodity that has forced labor in it. And I think that is really important when you're looking at Xinjiang. And then the transparency question that you had. One, we're very grateful to you and Representative Maloney and others who have been working on the transparency bill for years. I've had several conversations with your staff recently about it. What we're thinking about that now, though, is that the California Supply Chain Transparency Act was passed. It's been almost 10 years now, and we've also had the UK and France and others, and we've had a lot of evidence now and a lot of experience in what those transparency bills are doing. And we're seeing that companies are, again, doing a lot of talk and not necessarily a lot of action. And so they'll say what they're doing, they'll talk about a code, they'll talk about posting something on their website, but there's actually not implementation that's happening on the ground. And so what we would love to see, Congressman, is moving beyond just transparency to more mandatory due diligence, where they're actually required to take steps in their supply chain once that the forced labor is discovered. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. So I'll take the three questions in order. So the ECPAT USA report that you're referencing was a 2013 report that was published called "And Boys Too," because as anyone in this room who has gone to a trafficking presentation knows, there's always a conversation about what does trafficking look like, and trafficking happens with girls and women, and then eventually someone says, oh, and boys too. That report was started with data that was collected as early as 2010. The report was issued in 2013. I was not with ECPAT USA at the time, but I was working in the field and remember reading this as a groundbreaking report. I recently had the opportunity to go back and revisit that report, and unfortunately, I have to tell you, the circumstances have not changed very much. I still go to presentations where people talk about, oh, and boys too are trafficked. There remains a critical shortage of services available for boys who have been trafficked. There is a tremendous need for shelter for boys who have been victims of commercial sexual exploitation. And so, unfortunately, when I first saw the date of the report, I thought, oh, we really need to do a radical update. Unfortunately, I don't think a radical update will show us much. There is more awareness. People are discussing this, but it's not at the point where it is. I know you mentioned there were some statistics that were done of how many boys are being trafficked. I've seen reports that actually indicated higher numbers, closer to 50%. We don't have good data. It's a hidden community. I can tell you that as part of ECPAT USA's work, we are constantly talking about the vulnerability of boys. And we talk about girls and boys in all of our presentations. We always make sure that we are speaking about girls and boys. We are talking about LGBTQ youth who are being trafficked, and there are some reports that show that there is a disproportionate percentage of those youth who are at risk. And so we try to be very inclusive and don't make it feel like this is only happening to girls. In terms of internet crimes, you're correct that the internet and social media provides wonderful opportunities for children. It can be very exciting. There can be a lot of relationships that are built up in a very positive way. You can build exciting communities, but it's a tremendous opportunity for exploitation. I recently attended a report that was discussed at the UN of the Broadband Commission's findings. I had worked as an attorney for many years, working with victims of trafficking, and as you know, there is a process called grooming. It can be a very extensive process by which a trafficker or a predator will win over a victim's trust and recruit them, in some cases, to engage in producing commercially.
No, if you just hold that thought,
Sure.
and maybe add to it, but we're almost out of time because of 3 votes have been called, so I would like to yield to Commissioner Sheila Jackson-Blake. But thank you.
Let me thank the co-chair for his leadership, and as well, let me thank our co-chair, Mr. McGovern. I have had the privilege of both serving on this commission since the great leadership of Tom Lantos, who this commission and his efforts overall on human rights. And it is clear that human trafficking is a scourge, not only around the world, but a scourge here in the United States. And I note the numbers that have been cited through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, 700,000, but 14,000 to 15,000 here in the United States. I would venture to say those numbers are low. And I'm very interested in hearing the discussion about boys, because it is our responsibility to get accurate numbers. Those numbers should come from the federal government, since we have access to a number of sources, and I will look to try to dig deep into that so that all of the advocacy groups can have the facts. But I am interested and delighted that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was reauthorized. Unfortunately, it seemingly has to be sunsetted, and it's been done every 5 years. But I'd like to start with you first, Ms. Cognan, if I have it right, as to what do you think the state of human trafficking is in the United States?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I can't speak to the state of trafficking within the United States because we are an international organization. But what I can say is that right now, what we're seeing through our member, which is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and that Neha has highlighted, is that there is definitely a challenge with labor trafficking and how that's being recognized. And I'll also add an additional layer. As a migration organization, we know that irregular migration does impact the occurrences of trafficking, and that migrant populations are more vulnerable. And so we are definitely concerned with there being increased border screening to ensure that people that are coming in are not victims of trafficking, and if they are, they're receiving the appropriate services that they deserve.
Thank you. Would someone else like to take that question?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I, prior to joining ECPAT USA, I am an attorney, and I actually, for about 13 years, represented many, many victims of human trafficking, both international and domestic, who were here in the United States. And I do believe the Trafficking Victims Protection Act has been absolutely essential in providing services to victims, in raising awareness about relief that's available, and offering critical protections. But unfortunately, it still remains a radically underreported crime that continues to exist. Reporting, and I'm very excited about the prospect of receiving data from you. It remains an ongoing challenge to spot those victims, and also now to persuade them that they are not criminals, but in fact victims in need of services and eligible for comprehensive assistance.
Well, you make a very important point. I come from Texas, and I see the increase because of the migrant situation at the border, and because of a huge refugee camp on the border in Mexico, makes mostly women and children enormously vulnerable. And I think as we look to utilize the very effective law that we are utilizing, we have to look in our own backyard as well to be able to emphasize best practices on dealing with migrant persons, stateless persons. I've written legislation to deal with the plight of stateless persons. The first group of trafficked persons I saw was on the border of Bangladesh with a longtime former Secretary of State, Secretary Madeleine Albright, where they were bringing trafficked persons back, or people used as slave labor who had been sold by desperate families. And we may not have that direct connection here, but we do have the migrants coming in from the Northern Triangle, Colombia, and Central America, and other countries rather, in that region, and those people are vulnerable. Anyone have any exposure and contact to those people?
So, Congresswoman, I just wanted to add that Solidarity Center is a member of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, which includes a number of U.S. service providers. And one of the things that they have noticed is that there is an increasing vulnerability to human trafficking to immigrants coming into the United States now. And in policies such as separating families from not allowing people to apply for asylum in the United States, all of these things are increasing migrant workers' vulnerability to trafficking. And we're also seeing workers who are in forced labor or other conditions in the United States afraid to report because then they think that they will be deported. And so the whole idea of separating labor law enforcement from immigration enforcement has been diminished recently, and that's actually increasing people's vulnerability to human trafficking in the U.S. And I'm sure the Freedom Network and others would love to provide you with some statistics, and we're actually just today submitted some feedback to the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, because they asked, as they're preparing the report every year, and ATTEST just submitted some testimony about what's happening in the United States currently, and actually thinking that the U.S. might need to have its ranking go down because of what's happening.
Well, let me just say that we are sensitive to this issue. As you well know, we have put the scourge of human trafficking and abuse in our immigration laws, but unfortunately sometimes there's pushback, and that is to give an individual an extension if they've been abused and or trafficked. In addition, we have done some work in judiciary, of course, in dealing with online sex trafficking, human trafficking, so we've tried to be complementary to what is being done in foreign affairs. I know you want to comment on, but let me put my last two questions out. I do want to look at the data collection and see where we are, and as we do so, look at the international realm as well. So and I do want to recognize Ms. Charette, I believe, but to say that one of the back ends of, or the front ends is, of course, laundering of the money. And so I thank you for that testimony. We'll look very deeply at your written testimony. But I do want to ask this question. There seems to be some Tier 3 countries that we really give a pass. We say they've made improvements. So if anyone wants to comment on the level of human trafficking in China. And then my last point is that I believe that the administration in particular took a different approach on aid under Tier 3 funding as related to Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Biting one hand and cutting off your nose doesn't help, and then denied funding regarding Ebola. How do we strike that balance when we have countries that are so devastated, and how do we let them know that we're not giving them a pass, but we're dealing with funding elsewhere, but not trying to stranglehold them as relates to deadly disease like this?
Congresswoman Lee, I had mentioned, I think before you entered, that the whole Tier 3 sanctions issue had affected my organization, the Solidarity Center, and some work that we were doing on safe migration to prevent trafficking in Burma and Laos. And so it's a very serious issue. We very much appreciated Congress's response. Looking at the Ebola issue, we were all quite shocked that something so serious had been stopped, the funding for it had been stopped. And I think clarification from Congress about what the intention was of the sanction regime would be really important. We see the sanctions as being extremely important, but recognize that programs that provide humanitarian assistance, such as the Ebola, but also programs that support democracy and human rights, should not be stopped as part of that.
Young lady yield.
There's 263 people. Let me just, that haven't voted. Let me just, does someone have the China thing? And then I'll be happy to yield to the chair. And thank you for that. What you're saying is it's not really the way we should do it. We should get our point across, sanction, but not when we're dealing with these crises that may impact the traffic victims. Thank you. I just heard that.
So my experience with a nexus of trafficking in China is with Chinese nationals who have been trafficked for sex in the United States. In my previous program, we represented about 1,000 women from China in the illicit massage parlor industry over a period of 4 years. And I do think that it is worth questioning, is there a nexus, like what is happening that there are so many women from China who are exiting China to be exploited in the commercial sex trade in the United States? And we did have clients indicate to us that they didn't exactly know the chain of how they were brought here, but they did feel that the Chinese government was monitoring their communications, and there was a sense with some of the victims that the Chinese government was on some level involved.
Well, let me conclude by saying you've given powerful testimony. I will end on my concern, China. There are many friends from China, many Chinese Americans, but we do know that there are challenges when a nation is that big and when we're in multiple relationships. So we're giving concessions on trade, and we don't want to tip the apple cart. But it is well known that there's a tremendous trafficking, in maybe sex trafficking, human trafficking, labor in China. Labor may not necessarily come this direction, but it may go in another direction in Asia, Asian Pacific. But I know that we have been at airports where large numbers of women, Chinese women, have come over for sex trafficking, and not really knowing what they were coming for. So I look forward to working on these sort of broad issues. And again, we have to vote. Let me thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Without objection to testimony from one of them is Cindy McCain, and the other is 3 women who wrote, Louise Shelby, Nancy Hurst. Without objection, their testimony will be made part of the record. We can't miss this
Thank you very much.
Hearing's adjourned.
You can get by. I will call you up. Okay, and you see where I'm running to. Thank you. I guess there's no statement. I don't know.
Yeah, any notes?
I am that. I am a link sister. Thank you. Oh, we did some things with the link before. Thanks. Founders Day. Thank you. You didn't do a statement, did you? I'll contact